Welcome to Arkabahçe. Today our topic, as you can see, is life. Why are we here? What is the purpose? We can sometimes live for many years. Some of us are 50, 60, 70 years old, and we begin to ask, why did I struggle all these years? And what have I understood from it? As teenagers, we're faced with so many issues in our lives. We have issues with our parents, we have issues with drugs, we have issues with education. All of these things begin to create stress in our lives. And we find ourselves in this really interesting moment, in this quandary. We say, how is it that somebody in Australia, where we have all of these things, and yet we're less happy than someone who's living in a third world country? These are questions that all of us need to answer. We have asked these questions in ourselves various times throughout our lives. Sometimes more obvious, sometimes not. Let me just give you a little bit of a snippet of how things function psychologically. When we're teenagers, we say to ourselves, the only reason I'm not happy right now is because I don't have a car, I don't have a family, I don't have a house, I don't have a career. So we use these as excuses to remain in the state we are, which is that we're struggling. At some point we do become adults, and we may be fortunate enough to have a good education which leads to a good career. That may end up in a good family with kids, bank account, etc., etc. What then becomes interesting is in the mid-40s or 50s, we find ourselves with all of these things that we aspire to, and yet we go into a midlife crisis. The question is, why is this happening? What are the processes that are happening in our lives that are causing us to go from an unknown state of why we're suffering to what we think should end the suffering, and yet the suffering doesn't end? So I want to talk to you about this problem of happiness. Why is it that we find it so difficult to be happy? Let's talk about this. Happiness is something that all of us want. It's never the case that you can ask somebody, do you not want happiness? They will always say yes. It's innate in all of us. Our soul yearns for happiness. But the problem is, we're looking for happiness in the next car, in the better house, maybe in the better partner, etc., etc. And the problem is, happiness doesn't have as conditions any of these. Happiness comes from, we have the Kabbalah here, as you can see. This is the diagram of the Kabbalah, and in the Kabbalah we can see number one, which is the Father, which is the truth, and we can see the Son, which is Chokma, which is love, and we can see the Holy Spirit, which is Bina, which is sacrifice. But these three forces are extremely important for us. One of these forces represents truth, the other one represents love, and the other one represents sacrifice. These three forces, when they are working well in our lives, produce this internal state called happiness. What we confuse happiness with is another version. It's called conditional happiness. I'll give you an example. So we yearn for a red Ferrari. We say, I'd love a red Ferrari. I've been asking my boss or my family to help me buy this red Ferrari. And eventually we may end up with the red Ferrari. And in the time that we're in that state of euphoria of having the red Ferrari, driving it past our friend's house, driving it along the beach, along the boulevard, etc., etc. But the moment the red Ferrari is scratched, the moment the red Ferrari breaks down, the moment the red Ferrari is stolen, the happiness that we thought we had disappears. So what has actually happened in this process? Why is it that this thing called happiness has left us with the red Ferrari? So for that reason we refer to that kind of happiness as conditional happiness. What we need to understand is somebody who doesn't have a red Ferrari, somebody who doesn't have the best career in their lives, somebody who doesn't have even their own country, somebody who may even be a refugee. A good example is the Dalai Lama. He's a refugee in another country in India. He doesn't have technically a job. He doesn't have a lot of money in his bank. And yet he's one of the most happiest human beings that walk this earth. It was very interesting. In one of his talks, he said that he met many presidents. And in their faces, he sees in the presidents stress. He sees them extremely stressed. And yet on his way back to the northern India where he lives, he'll go past some farmers And in the faces of the farmers, he sees happiness. This is a very interesting for us all to be looking at. Why is life such a difficult thing for us to observe? Why is it that we find ourselves sometimes in a good financial state? We may have a very good bank balance. We may have all of the things that all of us aspire to. And yet we find that this thing called happiness isn't in our life. So I want to talk to you now a little bit about the breakup of these three things. What is truth, what is love, and what is sacrifice? These three forces, depending on your background, if you're a Christian, you would refer to them as Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. If you're a Hindu, you would say Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. If you're a scientist, you would say proton, neutron, electron. These three forces are the forces that make up the universe. Everything works with these three forces. Even a simple, humble breath. When we breathe in, it's the truth. The pause, the little pause that exists between the in-breath and the exhalation is love. And the third part, where we give back, because if you observe for a moment, when you breathe in, you can't keep the breath. It's impossible for you to keep the breath. So it's a natural process that we actually exhale, and that's the sacrifice. So everything that exists in the universe, whether we look at the galaxy, whether we look at the solar system or the planets turning around it, or we look at a simple hydrogen or a helium atom, we find this process of the Trinity. This Trinity is what makes life go around. And our job, if we want this thing called happiness, we need to find the conditions, the correct conditions for happiness. For example, we may find ourselves in a business and we have a customer who comes to us and says, I am interested in your software. And he may make, let's say, an error. He may say, is it true that your software is about $7,000 when we know that we're selling this software to everyone else for $5,000? Now at this point we have a challenge on our hands. Are we going to go with this force, this very powerful force called truth? Because it actually is the most powerful force that exists in the universe. What happens sometimes is we have desire, we have greed, we have all of these other forces that are trying to drag us away from the truth. So we find ourselves in this very, very precarious position. So we say, do we go along with the 7,000 and take the money because it's $2,000 more than we charge for everybody else? But if we listen to our heart, if we listen to that force that the Orientals calls the kaom, which is the internal part of us that knows how to work with this force, we'll tell the customer, no, I'm sorry, I think you've made a mistake. The actual price of that software is $5,000, not $7,000. Now, it's decisions like this in our life that get us closer to this thing called happiness. It's not the fact that we have the best house in the street. It's not the fact that we have a $1 million yacht in the bay. It's not the fact that we travel all around the world in first to business class seats. These aren't the things that bring us what we would call genuine, unconditional happiness. So if we find ourselves in a position where we're struggling in life, one of the things that we recommend to our students is to stop everything and simply enter a meditation. We're going to talk more in future programs. We're going to talk to you about stress. We're going to talk to you about drugs, the relationships between parents and their children and why these relationships can become sometimes unbearable. And eventually we'll talk to you about karma and how karma works in our lives. Why do we suffer so much? Why do bad things happen even though we're trying so hard to be good human beings? All of these things cause confusion sometimes. And eventually in our final program, we'll talk to you about the solution, the overall solution. If you have questions regarding these sorts of things, at the bottom of the screen, you'll see our website and our emails. And we will eventually cover all of these aspects at some point. It's very important for all of us to stop and ask these questions. We kind of ask them sometimes, but at the wrong time. We ask them when things are really, really bad. We ask them when we're in hospital lying down, maybe because of cancer or something really, really nasty in our lives. But we should be asking them when we're in a good position. We should be able to learn that there are techniques that can help us through these processes called suffering and stress, etc., etc. Just repeating, if you have any questions regarding any of the topics we've covered so far today, you can actually email us at samozluk@gmail.com, and you can go to our website, samozluk.com.au. In our next program in Arkabahçe, we'll be talking to you about stress. As you are aware, we are in a great deal of stress. Whether we're very, very wealthy or whether we're poor, all of us have to live with this problem called stress. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.